Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today is Monday and that means that it's time to write, right? So today I want to talk about research. No matter what you write, even if it's copywriting, you want to write historical fiction, for instance, science fiction, non-fiction, theater plays, screenplays, whatever you want to write, research is very important. And there's one rule that I never find in books, and that is try to balance your research in a way that you don't know more than your reader needs to know. Think about that one. So, don't know more than your reader needs to know. Because if you are very, very well informed about a certain topic that comes up in one of your stories or in your non-fiction book or in a product that you are selling, you have the tendency to tell too much, to give too much information, a sort of information dump. And that is really hard to avoid. And the only way you can avoid it is to keep your research well balanced and you don't go too deep into the subject. So, it helps you in a way to tell your story easier and more quickly. It helps you also to keep balance between research and writing, because research is often used as a way of procrastination, and it's also a way to deal with your fear of writing. So good research is also a mental battle in a way. So if you want to, suppose you want to read a non-fiction book, or you want to suppose you want to write a non-fiction book, or let's say historical fiction. Or as in my case, for instance, I will use a script that I've written about Edith Cavell. Edith Cavell was a British nurse who lived in Brussels while the First World War broke out. And after a year, she was executed by the German authorities for espionage. I set myself a time, 6 months, to do the research and to know more about her story, to know more about her life, where she has been, the houses she has visited. And during that research, I figured out that the research was incomplete. So I read all the books that were available, but most of them were written by French people or French-speaking people and British people. A very important part of the country, of my country, was lacking. And so what Edith Cavell did, in a way she used her clinic as a sort of a hideout for men who either were British and were stuck behind the enemy line, or for French and other nationalities that want to get to Great Britain. And by that time, the Netherlands were not involved in the war. And so she managed to smuggle those men to the Dutch border. Funny thing is that all the research, oh my God, what is happening here? All the research was done up until Brussels, and then for some weird way, the Dutch-speaking part of the country that you really need to get to the Dutch border was never spoken about. And I knew for a fact that she was, for instance, in Ghent, and that she stayed there to meet with important people that could help her with the smuggle route to the Dutch border. I also know for a fact that she has crossed the border herself, which was then known as the Wire of Death. So people were very, when it was like 1914, people knew of electricity, and some houses and some villages already had electricity, like the big villages, but like people who lived in the country didn't have electricity, and so they were not really aware of the dangers of electricity. The Germans built the Wall of Death, or the Wire of Death, on the Belgian part of the Dutch border, and when you tried to cross it, it was like, so hazardous that you were fried, you know, you could have been fried. And so I researched that, I researched how you could cross the Wire of Death, and they used a sort of wooden frame that they could, it was like a sort of trapezium that he could open, and the frame would make a hole bigger in the wire, and so they could climb through it. But then after the wire there was also minefield, so it was a very, very hard, hazardous undertaking. How I did my research for the Dutch part, well, I remember a lot of stories of my grandfather, who was also a soldier in the First World War, and he was a storyteller, and he always talked about the English woman who saved a lot of men. And I also read diaries, and I read about daily life during the First World War under German occupation. So there was a lot of smuggling going on. A lot of women, they all wore very, very long skirts, and in those skirts they could hide like butter and bacon and stuff like that. And so I really had to research all of that. And I also had not an uncle, but a great uncle that was a monk, and he was very interested in the First World War, so he helped me. I knew of, he didn't help me, but he had a lot of stories written down, and I could look his name up, and all those stories came up. So I could do more research, diving deeper into what Edith Cavell has done. And also she discovered a huge fraud that was a big part why the United States didn't join the First World War earlier. And I have hardly seen any texts about it, so it was a huge cover-up. Then you also, those are the things you have to be prepared for, because not always, especially if you are writing something historical, not all the research is often complete. What I also did for Edith Cavell is talk to a historian that is was specialized in, or is specialized in, medical history around that time. So she was really specialized in the knowledge of the nurses during the First World War and afterwards, and a little bit before. I think she started with the Crim War. And so I could check off a lot of questions with her. I also read about or the little booklet that what's her name, Florence Nightingale wrote for nurses, a sort of handbook for nurses. So I read that too. So I was aware of how they used by that time, how they cleaned their instruments, for example, or what they did to isolate a patient. What they also did is they were very firm believers in beef tea. Beef tea is a broth of beef, and a lot of patients were not capable of eating, so they gave them beef tea to regain strength, things like that. I also knew that, for instance, Edith Cavell was a heart patient. She had several heart attacks, and it was actually by accident. I didn't know that, I didn't realize that, but the way a woman experiences a heart attack is completely different as a man. That's why women are way more, how you call it, victims of cardiac arrest than men, because we don't recognize a female heart attack. A female heart attack is often felt as problems with the stomach, as feeling unwell, vomiting. It's not like with the pain in your arm. It's nothing like that. It's more vomiting and feeling nauseated. So you have to know all those things to tell a realistic story. I also needed to know more about her employer and where she lived, and you have to know how much a stay in a hospital cost at that time, and how long they stayed in a hospital. She always had the windows open of the infirmaries, and you have to know why she did that. You have to know how much time it takes to travel from city A to B. Were the trains riding in those days? We had a very well, we still have an extremely well organized railway system. We have trams, stuff like that. You have to know how much time it took to travel from city A to B, not only by tram, by car, by those were then the like the Minervas and the 4Ts and stuff, or even older. You have to know, are there trucks already by that time? How much time does it take to travel with a horse and a carriage, or a horse and a cart? All those things you have to do, or by bike. Those are all things you have to keep in mind. Then for a book, I had to research. Suppose you want to tell a story about a woman who leaves her husband in the 17th century. She lives in France. Her husband is abusive. She has no children yet, or they are older and they're left the house. How would she do that? How would she leave her husband? How would she travel? How much things would she own? What would she own? What could she do to make a living? There's a lot more than just prostitution. Would she be able to stay in a hotel? You all have to research those things. A very good author to go to is Simon Schama, because he uses a lot of documents to tell his story. He uses, for instance, when people go bankrupt, he uses the notary entrances of what a person owned at that time. So those are very interesting. Like a woman would own a brass, a pot, a cast iron pot to cook, and some spoons, and sometimes some spinning wheel or something like that. All those things are important to know. So you have to open your options, and you have to also know where it is important to know. If it's important to know if for instance, if she would leave a city, could she live in a village? Or those are all things you have to consider and you have to know. And if she had the right to flee her husband, if she wouldn't, the other way around, that I know. I know that a man can't leave his, for instance, if he would live in the 16th, 17th century in Belgium, or in the Netherlands, the Low Countries, we know that a man couldn't leave his family without notice. So the mayor was responsible of tracking down the husband. And in the meantime, the mayor paid for the household, so the woman could survive and the kids could survive, and that the rent was paid and everything. And so yeah, it was very important for the mayor to find that man. And so does it work the other way around? I don't know. So for those things, you have to contact people that know those things. So it's always easy to find the people who do research in that area. You can find that on the websites of all the universities, and they are always happy to talk about their interests. Suppose you want to write a story about somebody who works in night shifts, or who is a nurse, or who is a truck driver. Talk to those people. Talk to them. If you see one, go up to them. There are very few people who don't like to talk about their profession. Talk about their daily life, how their life is structured, how their day is structured, what do they need, how, for instance, a truck driver who does long distances, how does he eat? Why does he cook something by himself? What does he do in his downtime? There's so many things you have to consider and to make your story believable, but you can't go too much into detail. What's also very important is when you suppose you want to write a scene that is a battle scene. No, not a battle scene, but more a fight, for instance, a fist fight. Or, a man attacks somebody from behind. It's often very useful to go to, for instance, to go to a club where they do protection, or female protection, for instance, or karate team or whatever, where you can train or at least experience the feeling of somebody being attacked or as the attacker. So you know perfectly what movements you have to make to immobilize somebody. It's way better as an experience as a reader to feel that the person who is writing that scene is very knowledgeable. For instance, like what's the Florida book that I just read? Stephen Florida. That was so great because he wrote about wrestling, but with inner knowledge, you could absolutely feel how the fight went because he knew what he was writing about. So it's always good to exercise or to at least try to do it yourself for once, not to murder a person, but to do the movements yourself to make sure that what you have in mind and reality are more or less doable and more or less realistic. So when you write about something that the reader who maybe knows karate knows, he did his research. That's fun to do. Those are the fun things to do. For instance, when you talk about a chef, for instance, you write about a chef, it is very important that you know how to cook. Or at least know how to cook the dishes he's making. And that gives the reader a sense of trust. He trusts you to guide them into your story, and that is very important. But when you go tell too many details about, suppose that you are talking about a chef and he puts a pan on the stove and you start to talk about the pan, what it's made of, how much temperature it needs to be at its best, about the Teflon or whatever. Those are things that's taking it too far. What is important, for instance, why he uses a copper pan, for instance, because it's probably because he inherited from his father, and it makes him feel in control or whatever because he has used it and seen it used for his entire life. That's another story. But when you go into technical details, it can be too much. And for instance, if you write like historical fiction but based in the military, you can go also quickly way too far with all the grades and so you have to keep it simple but believable. And don't play a game with your readers as if you know more, but you don't want to tell them, because that frustrates too. So it's all about balance. What does the reader needs to know? That is more important than what do you want to know as a writer. It's always about the reader. Always about the reader. What you think, what you want, do that for your private life. But what you write, always do it with your reader in mind. It's also very important to do research when it comes to your readers, especially when you do copywriting. You have to know who you're talking to. And it's important to have somebody in mind to whom you're writing. So, for example, suppose you're writing a short story about science fiction, but it's not science fiction for the person who reads nothing but science fiction, not the tech guy. No, think of somebody in your environment that likes to read but has never read science fiction, and you want to write that story. You keep that person in mind and always think, will she or he understand it? That's very important. So yeah, that's a bit it. I hope you've learned something about it. Oh yeah, always put a timing. Say I will do 6 months of research and then stop at the 5th, because you will never be ready, never. So start earlier with your writing than you have planned. That's very important. And you see whatever comes up, you can research it later. If you don't want to mess up your writing flow, make sure you have sort of a sign in your text that you can look up, and then put it in a certain color or whatever. That is also very important, so you don't get out of your flow. And you can do that. You can check things, for instance, if they travel, or with what money they pay in those days, or whatever. And or what shoes they are wearing in those days, and whatever. And then you can come back whenever your story is completed, your first draft, because you have to always write a second draft. That's very, very, very important. And then you can do the necessary research, but don't stop your writing to do the research. That's not very good. So you have to be sure that you know the things to start, but you don't have to know everything. Sometimes an idea will pop up. Write your idea down, continue with your story, and then when you're finished, then do your research. It'll always work out, don't worry about it. So yeah, research, balance. Don't spend too much time on your research. Always think of what does the reader needs to know, not what you want to know. And when you are describing movements, do them, so you can be more knowledgeable in a way, and your reader will trust you more. And yeah, that's about it. So I hope you like this one. Bye bye. Talk to you in a fortnight. Bye bye.